In the quiet hills of Bethlehem, where the sheep grazed under the open skies and the sun bathed the land in golden warmth, there lived a boy named David. He was the youngest of 8 sons born to a man named Jesse. While his older brothers trained with swords and armor, preparing for war, David spent his days in the fields, just him, the sheep, and the wine. David was no ordinary boy. His heart was soft toward God, and his spirit was strong and courageous. From a young age, he had learned to protect his father's sheep from lions and bears. With only a sling and a shepherd's staff, he fought off wild beasts, not with fear, but with faith. And when he sat on the hillsides under the stars, he would play his harp and sing to the Lord. His songs filled the night air with melodies of trust, love, and praise. The people of Bethlehem didn't think much of David. He was just a shepherd boy, the youngest in his family, quiet, thoughtful, always talking to God. But heaven saw something different. While others looked at his small frame and dirty clothes, God looked at his heart, a heart full of faith, courage, and humility. One afternoon, while David tended his flock near a brook, his harp resting against a tree, the wind carried whispers from afar. Back at home, the prophet Samuel had arrived. God had sent him to anoint the next king of Israel, someone chosen not by strength or size, but by the content of their heart. Jesse lined up all his sons, strong, tall, proud men before the prophet. Samuel looked at each one, thinking, surely this must be the one. But each time, God said, no, not him. One by one, the sons passed before Samuel, and still none were chosen. Are these all your sons? Samuel asked. There is still the youngest, Jesse replied. He's out in the fields, tending the sheep. Samuel nodded. Send for him. We'll not sit down until he comes. And so they waited. Far out in the field, David saw a servant running toward him. Your father has called you. The prophet Samuel is waiting. David brushed the dust from his tunic, wiped his hands, and followed the servant. When he arrived, the prophet looked at him and paused. David was young, his skin sun-kissed, his eyes sharp and alive. There was something about him that made heaven lean in closer. Then God spoke to Samuel's heart. This is the one. Anoint him. And right there, in the midst of his family, the prophet took a flask of oil and poured it on David's head. The oil ran down his hair and over his face. His brothers stared in shock. This shepherd boy, the youngest of them all. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. But David did not run to the palace. He returned to his sheep, to the hills, to the harp and the stars. He continued to worship, to protect, to serve. Because David knew something the world often forgets: greatness doesn't begin on thrones. It begins in obedience, in faithfulness, and in quiet moments when no one is watching. And while the armies of Israel trembled before a giant they could not defeat, God was preparing a boy in the fields, training his hands to fight and his heart to trust. The shepherd boy was becoming a warrior, and soon, the world would know his name. And so, the valley trembled beneath the weight of one man's voice. Day after day, the giant Philistine Goliath of Gath stepped forward, clad in bronze like a walking fortress. His voice boomed across the hills, mocking the armies of Israel, defying the living God. None dared answer him, not even the bravest warriors, not even King Saul. But on this day, something different stirred in the camp, not a seasoned soldier, but a shepherd boy. David, the youngest of Jesse's sons, had come bearing bread and supplies. Yet what he found grieved his spirit, the people of God cowering in fear, their courage shattered. He listened, stunned, as Goliath's challenge echoed again across the valley. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? David whispered to no one in particular, that he should defy the armies of the living God. His words spread quickly. His eldest brother, Eliab, burned with anger. Why have you come down here, David? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride. You only came to watch the battle. But David turned, undeterred. Is there not a cause? And indeed, there was. Word of his boldness reached Saul. The boy was summoned to the king's tent. There, David declared with quiet fire, let no man's heart fail. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. Saul, though impressed, hesitated. You are not able to fight him. You are but a youth, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David stood tall with memory. When I kept my father's sheep, a lion came. Then a bear. I struck them both. this Philistine will be like one of them. The Lord who delivered me then will deliver me now." And with that, the king relented. David tried on Saul's armor, but it hung heavy on his frame. He took it off. What he needed was not armor forged by men, but confidence forged by faith. So David walked alone, down the hill and into history, with nothing but his sling, 5 smooth stones, and the name of the Lord God of Israel in his heart. Across the valley, Goliath saw him and laughed. "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" But David kept walking. This was not the story of a boy facing a giant. It was the story of a giant underestimating a boy who walked with God. The valley fell silent as David stepped forward, the youngest among warriors, with nothing but a sling in his hand and 5 smooth stones in his pouch. On the opposite hill, Goliath, towering, armored, and fearsome, let out a roar of laughter. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" He mocked, raising his massive spear. David didn't flinch. "I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts," he declared boldly. "Today, he will deliver you into my hands." Without hesitation, David reached into his pouch, took out a stone, and slung it with all his might. The stone soared through the air, swift, precise, and struck Goliath square in the forehead. The giant staggered, then collapsed to the ground with a thunderous crash. A gasp rippled through both camps. Silence turned to shock, and then chaos. The Philistines panicked, fleeing in all directions. The Israelites surged forward in triumph, their faith rekindled by a shepherd boy's victory. And there, in the midst of the dust and broken spears, stood David, quiet, steady, holding Goliath's sword in hand, lifting it high as a symbol of God's power and faithfulness. When the battlefield dust settled and the giant's body lay silent in the valley, a mighty cheer thundered across the hills. Israel had triumphed, not by sword or spear, but by the faith of a boy with a sling. David, breathless and steady, stood before King Saul. He was no longer just the shepherd boy from Bethlehem, he was now the champion of Israel. The king stared at him in awe, hardly believing this youthful warrior had felled the giant that had haunted his army for weeks. But it was not long before the whole kingdom echoed with David's name. As the army marched back to Jerusalem in victory, women poured into the streets singing joyful songs. Tambourines and lyres filled the air as they chanted, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." And though it was meant in celebration, the words pierced the heart of King Saul like a dagger. Jealousy crept into the king's heart like a shadow, unseen and slow. Saul watched David rise, loved by the people, praised by the warriors, and favored by God. But David's rise was not prideful. He walked humbly. He still visited his father's sheep, still prayed in quiet places, and still trusted God more than he trusted men. It was during this time that Saul's son, Jonathan, saw something remarkable in David. Their friendship blossomed like a river in the desert. Jonathan, a prince and a warrior himself, took off his royal robe and gave it to David, along with his sword, bow, and belt, a symbol that he honored David more than himself. David was invited into the palace. He played the harp for the king during dark moods, and his music brought peace. The harp strings seemed to carry heaven's breath, calming Saul's tormented spirit. Yet Saul's jealousy only deepened. One evening, as David played for him, the king's hand gripped a spear. Without warning, he hurled it across the room. The sharp edge barely missed David, striking the wall behind him. David fled, heart pounding, not in fear, but in sorrow. He had done no wrong. He had fought bravely. He had only loved the king, but Saul's heart had turned cold. Still, David remained faithful. He led Saul's armies in battle with wisdom far beyond his years. Victory followed him like a shadow, and with every triumph, Saul's rage grew. One night, as David prayed beneath the starlit sky, he cried out, "Lord, why does the one I serve now seek to harm me? Show me the path of peace and protect me." And in that quiet hour, David found peace, even in uncertainty. In the court of a jealous king, David moved with grace. In a world of fear and envy, he chose to serve with humility. And though danger would follow him for many days, the God who had helped him slay the lion, the bear, and the giant would never leave him. This was no longer just the story of a shepherd. It was the rise of a king, chosen not by men but by God. The days in the palace grew darker, not in light but in intention. Though David had married Michal, Saul's own daughter, Peace did not settle in Saul's heart. Instead, jealousy burned hotter than ever. The people's love for David only fanned the flames, and Saul's mind became a battlefield of envy and fear. David, unaware of the brewing storm, remained loyal, leading men, praying in the quiet hours, and playing music that once brought Saul peace. But Saul no longer found comfort in melodies. Only wrath stirred within. One afternoon, while David played his harp before the king as he had many times, Saul gripped his spear, his face dark with madness. Without warning, he hurled it across the room straight at David, but the Lord was with David. He dodged swiftly and fled from the king's presence. Michal, having seen her father's eyes before such rage, warned David. That very night, she helped him escape through a window. As guards came searching, she placed an idol in the bed and covered it with goat's hair, buying David precious time. Her courage was a shield in that moment, a reminder of how love can defy even a king's fury. Meanwhile, David fled to Samuel at Ramah, seeking refuge and guidance. Together they prayed, and the prophet shared words from the Lord. But Saul was relentless. Upon hearing David's location, he sent men to seize him. Yet something divine happened. Those who came to capture David began to prophesy. They could not lay hands on him, for the Spirit of God intervened. Even Saul himself came, but before he could strike, the Spirit overwhelmed him too, and he prophesied all day and night. It was a scene that left the people speechless. Is Saul also among the prophets? They asked in amazement. David knew this was not the end. He journeyed next to find Jonathan, Saul's son and his closest friend. Their bond was unbreakable, knit together by loyalty and truth. David poured out his fears. "What have I done to your father?" he asked. Jonathan, torn between love for his father and loyalty to David, devised a plan. "Tomorrow, I'll test my father's heart. If he means harm, I'll let you know." The next day, during the feast, Saul noticed David's absence. At first, he said nothing. But on the second day, when Jonathan explained that David had gone to Bethlehem for a family offering, Saul exploded in rage. He cursed Jonathan, accusing him of siding with his rival. Then, in a moment of madness, he hurled his spear at his own son. Grieved and angered, Jonathan left the table. The next morning, he went into the field with his servant. As planned, he shot arrows beyond the lad and gave the signal. David awaited. Hidden in the field, David wept silently. When the boy had gone, David and Jonathan met one final time. They embraced, tears falling freely. "Go in peace," Jonathan said, "for we have sworn before the Lord to remain true to one another." And so, David fled once more, hunted by a king, protected by God, and strengthened by a friend's love. The wilderness ahead would test him like never before. After many days on the run, David found himself deep in the wilderness of En-Gedi, a rugged land of caves and wild goats, of silence and solitude. The once shepherd boy, now a humble fugitive, had become the leader of a band of outcasts, men who were broken, in debt, or mistreated by the world. But under David, they found purpose and hope. David never sought revenge against Saul, even when the king's cruelty gave him every reason. But one day, a test came. Saul, with 3,000 chosen men, had entered the desert to hunt David down once more. Weary from the pursuit, the king stepped away from his army and entered a cave to rest, not knowing that David and his men were hiding in the shadows of that very cave. David's men whispered with excitement. They urged him forward, believing this moment to be a divine setup, the very day God would deliver Saul into David's hand. Slowly, silently, David crept toward the unsuspecting king. A knife was drawn, but instead of harming Saul, David cut off a corner of his royal robe. Even then, his heart felt heavy with conviction. He had touched the Lord's anointed, and even that was too much. When Saul left the cave, David stepped out and called after him. "My lord the king." Saul turned, startled. There stood David, holding the piece of his robe. David spoke with honor and sorrow. He declared his innocence, that he bore Saul no harm. He could have taken Saul's life, but he chose mercy instead. Saul was overcome, his heart softened, and he wept. The proud king, broken for a moment, lifted his voice and said, "You are more righteous than I. May the Lord reward you for the good you have done to me today. Surely you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands." David bowed his head in respect. He did not rejoice in Saul's remorse, nor did he claim the throne. He returned to the wilderness, waiting for God's time. David had passed the test. He had chosen mercy over vengeance, patience over power. And though he was still a fugitive, he was being shaped into the kind of king Israel had never known, one after God's own heart. In this quiet victory, the world saw not the triumph of a sword, but the glory of restraint, faith, and a heart fully surrendered. David's years in hiding had grown him, not only in skill or leadership but in spirit, in patience, in humility. Though hunted like a criminal, he had hurt no man. Though wronged, he had never taken revenge. And the people began to notice. Whispers of his righteousness traveled through the land. King Saul's days grew darker, fear consumed him. Paranoia drove him to desperation. And finally, on a bitter day in battle, Saul fell by his own sword, defeated not just by his enemies, but by the weight of his disobedience. When news of Saul's death reached David, he did not rejoice. He tore his robe and wept bitterly. He mourned for Saul the king anointed by God and for Jonathan, his dearest friend. David's heart, though wounded and weathered, remained soft. Time passed, and the elders of Israel came to David, bowing in reverence. "You shall be our king," they said. And so, the shepherd who once guarded sheep now stood before the nation as its ruler. But David did not let the crowd change him. He ruled from Jerusalem, the city of peace, with justice and reverence for the Lord. Under his reign, enemies were pushed back, borders secured, and worship restored. Yet David's victories were not only on battlefields. His true strength lay in how he ruled his heart, with repentance when he failed, with compassion for the weak, and with unshakable trust in God. The once young boy who faced a giant with stones and faith had now become a king who knelt before a greater throne, the throne of heaven. He danced before the Ark of the Covenant, not with pride, but with praise. And he wrote psalms not for fame, but for truth. Even in his old age, David's voice sang with the same boldness that once rang out in the valley of Elah. "The Lord is my shepherd," he declared, "I shall not want." And so his legacy was sealed not just as a mighty warrior, not just as Israel's greatest king, but as a man after God's own heart.